Back in the early 2000s, when I was just a young child, my parents had to leave me home alone for a few hours one evening. It wasn't unusual. They had their occasional outings, and I was used to being alone. That night, however, would become one I'd never forget. As the evening darkened, I occupied myself with my toys and the television, trying not to think about being alone in the house. My parents had left a list of phone numbers in case of an emergency, reassuring me that they were just a call away. Around 9 p.m. the phone rang, jolting me from my cartoons. I answered, expecting to hear my parents' voice, but instead, a strange, raspy voice greeted me. "Is your mommy home?" I felt my heart race as I replied, "No, she's not here right now." The voice on the other end continued, "And where's your daddy?" Panic surged within me. How did this stranger know my parents' names? My voice trembled as I stammered, "He's not home either." The stranger then said, "Well, little one, I know you're home alone. I've been watching, don't be scared. I'm just looking for a friend." A shiver ran down my spine as I hung up the phone, tears welling in my eyes. I tried to convince myself it was a prank, but the fear was all too real. The phone rang again and again, the same voice repeatedly asking about my parents and insisting that he knew I was home alone. I mustered the courage to dial my parents' number, my hands trembling. They assured me that they were on their way back home and told me to lock all the doors and windows. The calls finally stopped, and I felt a momentary relief. As I peeked out the window, I spotted an unfamiliar car parked on the street. A sinking feeling gripped me as I realized it was the same car that had been there when the calls started. Panic surged through me once more. Who was this persistent caller, and why were they parked outside my house? I immediately called my parents back, frantic, and they told me to stay hidden and not answer the door. They said they were almost home. The minutes felt like hours as I waited, the unsettling feeling of being watched never leaving me. Finally, the familiar sight of my parents' car pulled into the driveway. They rushed inside, and my dad quickly looked out the window. The car outside sped away, disappearing into the night. The police were called, but the identity of the persistent caller remained a mystery. They couldn't track the calls, and the car's license plate turned out to be fake. The whole incident left my family shaken and anxious. We took extra precautions after that night, installing security systems and never leaving me home alone for too long. The fear of the late-night caller stalking us remained a dark and haunting memory from the early 2000s. It was a lesson learned about the importance of staying safe and vigilant, even within the walls of our own home. A few years ago, I found myself caught in a chilling and bewildering encounter with a persistent stranger. It was an ordinary day, much like any other, when I received a phone call that would set off a week-long nightmare. The call came in unexpectedly, and when I answered, all I heard was heavy breathing on the other end. It sent shivers down my spine, and I couldn't help but ask, "Who is this?" There was a brief pause, and then a man's voice, cold and emotionless, replied, "I've been looking for you." My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of this unsettling call. I didn't recognize the voice, and I had no idea who this person could be. "You have the wrong number," I stammered, my voice shaking. But the stranger's response was even more unnerving. He recited my full name and address, causing a wave of fear to wash over me. It was as if he knew everything about me. I demanded answers, but he simply hung up. Disturbed and shaken, I decided to block the caller's number, hoping to put an end to the bizarre encounter. But the nightmare had only just begun. Over the next few days, the calls continued, each time from a different number. The stranger's words became more ominous, and he made veiled threats that sent a chill down my spine. No matter how many times I blocked his numbers, he found a way to reach me. I confided in my friends and family, and they urged me to contact the authorities, but I was reluctant to involve the police at that point. Instead, I took precautions, changing my locks and being vigilant about my surroundings. The feeling of being watched never left me, and I couldn't escape the dread that came with each call. One evening, as I answered yet another call, the stranger's voice grew more sinister. "You can't hide forever," he hissed, and my patience had run its course. I knew I had to put an end to this torment. I contacted my service provider and decided to change my phone number, hoping that it would finally sever the connection to this relentless stalker. It was a difficult decision, as it meant letting go of my old number and the memories associated with it, but my peace of mind was worth the sacrifice. With the new number in place, the calls and messages finally stopped. The relief was overwhelming, and I gradually began to regain a sense of normalcy. The identity of the persistent stranger remained a mystery, and I couldn't help but wonder about his motives and why he had targeted me. The experience left me forever changed, my sense of security shattered. It was a haunting reminder that danger can lurk in unexpected places, and that sometimes the only way to find peace is to cut the ties that bind us to the past. In the early 1990s, my life took a chilling turn as I became ensnared in a nightmare I could never have anticipated. It all began with a single, haunting phone call. One quiet evening, I was engrossed in a book when the phone rang. I picked it up, expecting to hear a familiar voice. Instead, I was met with a stranger's eerie words. "I've been watching you, Jennifer." My heart raced, and I demanded, "Who is this? How do you know me?" The voice on the other end laughed coldly and replied, "I know more than you think." Terror gripped me as the stranger described my appearance and detailed what I had been doing just moments before. I hung up, my hands trembling. I couldn't shake the feeling of being violated and exposed. The nightmare continued the following day when the same man showed up at my doorstep. He introduced himself as Dan, a neighbor I had seen around but never known. He acted as if we were old friends, recounting my daily activities and the intimate details he had gleaned from his disturbing surveillance. Panicked and unnerved, I called the police, hoping they would put an end to this horrifying intrusion. They arrived promptly and questioned Dan, who seemed unfazed, denying any wrongdoing and claiming he had been concerned for my well-being. The police couldn't find enough evidence to charge him, and I was left feeling vulnerable and trapped. I decided to take matters into my own hands and sought a restraining order against Dan, hoping it would finally provide the protection I so desperately needed. The legal process was arduous, but the relief of obtaining the restraining order was immeasurable. It was the first step in regaining control over my life and a semblance of safety. Over time, the harassment ceased, and the memory of that nightmarish ordeal began to fade. Yet the experience left me with scars that would never fully heal. It was a stark reminder that danger can lurk closer than we'd ever imagine, even behind the facade of a seemingly ordinary neighbor.